Thanks very much. I've subtitled my talk Politics for Grown-Ups. And this because when I was reading about this whole issue of the Howard government winning this big prize of control of the Senate, some of the academic commentary and commentary from the media was, I thought, pretty childish. So I think if you're going to be in politics, you've got to play it fairly seriously. So I'll outline more of this as we go along. So my talk, a bit about the 2004 election win, a bit about the poison chalice argument, that winning the Senate was a poison chalice. And I'm going to talk a bit about context of politics and history, and that you can't look at any issue unless you get the context right. And that's often a reason why governments and politicians do the things they do. In retrospect, I have a different view, but sometimes where they are, what they're experiencing, what they've been experiencing affects their behaviour. I'm going to look very briefly what the government did in using the Senate, not as good as Sean Carney and the talk we've had, which I will definitely be looking forward to read, and some general conclusions. So just a bit about the 2004 election. I don't quite agree with Murray Goode that it was sort of, well, he wasn't quite saying this, but I think it was a surprise all round a bit that the Howard government sort of won, even the House of Reps, because at the time I didn't think it was very certain. But when you think about it, it was a pretty good win. 87 seats, net gain of 4 seats, swing towards them, two-party preferred vote, 52.7. That's a pretty good win, okay? That's a pretty good win, compared to what we've just had, where the government just got back, really. And then the big surprise, winning control of the Senate. And here's one of the few things I agree with Senator Brandis with. It was an outcome that nobody expected, right? It was not predicted. And I think that has a very important impact on what the Howard government subsequently did. It wasn't expected, and it opened all sorts of opportunities that weren't planned for, that weren't in election manifestos and so on. And if you're a politician, if you're a good politician and an opportunity comes, you want to grab that opportunity as much as possible. You're in a serious game, and if you're in a serious policy player, like I think John Howard is and the Howard government was, you want to use it. So some issues about this whole issue. Did getting control of the Senate, and there's another win, did it all go to their heads? Did it mean they got disconnected from the electoral mood? Okay, that sort of argument, I think. Was WorkChoices, and there was other things other than WorkChoices, was it really the result, we've got this power now, let's ramp everything up and sort of go for it, or was there something else going on? And then the third issue, which keeps coming up, that naughty, terrible Howard government, it used its numbers in the Senate. Shock, horror. You couldn't possibly be allowed to use its numbers in the Senate. In fact, the Senate democratically elected. Everyone just seems to forget. So that was some of the arguments. The poison chalice words came from Andrew Robb after the 2007 election. And, this is the argument. The Howard government engaged in more radical policies. Now, the radical is in the eye of the beholder. If you read Judith Brett's piece after the 2011 election, one would think that the Howard government was pursuing extreme policies. There was almost nothing it had done that was worthwhile. It was one of the papers that really, really bugged me. Then there's the Senate Review and Accountability Functions. The Senate, this great institution, this House of Review and Accountability. Let's have a little bit of a look about that a bit more seriously, especially in terms of the so-called Westminster system. And sort of the view the government threw caution to the wind, as if Howard never took a risk or chance or gave it a go. Who are we kidding? And so on. So here are the views. Judith Brett's view. After he unexpectedly won the election, etc., WorkChoices, It was his biggest misjudgment of his political career and goes a long way to explaining why nothing went right for him in 2007. Without the constraint of the Senate, he succumbed to the hubris of power. So the Michael Danby argument, if you like. And Harry Evans, the clerk of the Senate, of course, he's highlighting it's a terrible thing that a government got control of the Senate. That's going to be the end of the House of Review functions and the ability to inquire functions, which the Senate was designed for, which he says in many different books and chapters, including one of mine. Okay, let's look at political context. Okay, and we all forget the Fraser Government. Remember the Fraser Government? Okay, and these are factors I think were impacting on the thinking subconsciously or consciously inside the government. The Fraser Government had control of the Senate. The view gradually in the Liberal Party was it was a period of lost opportunities from a sort of a right of centre conservative viewpoint. You know, Gerald Henderson had that viewpoint. I think Mr Howard had that viewpoint as his treasurer, as he tried to bring in some reforms. The Howard government had that, the Fraser government had that power and didn't use it. That's sort of one of the arguments, okay? I'm not saying the Fraser government didn't achieve things or do things. Mr Fraser did do lots of things, but it didn't meet the agenda. And the Liberals had this thing, if we get back in power again, if we ever get that chance, we should not let that opportunity go. Remember, there were 13 years the Liberal Party coalition were in opposition and the fight between the wets and the dries. And essentially the dries won. Okay, that's what the fight was, up to a point. Then the Howard government was elected in 1996 overwhelmingly on basically a neoliberal agenda. Now, neoliberal is used by academics as a term of negativeness. Well, neoliberalism has saved Australia, as far as I'm concerned, okay? Budget control, deregulation, all those things, we wouldn't be the state we are, and it was largely also adopted by the Hawke-Keating government in many areas, okay? So can we stop attacking neoliberalism? And then we come to the mandate. They had this mandate about industrial relations reform. John Howard had been Shadow Minister for Industrial Relations. He came to election. But to get their legislation through in the first term, they had to make lots of compromises, 171 amendments. Gwen Singleton says, representing a significant compromise. Now, you just think, you've been in opposition for 13 years, you win a landslide election, but you haven't got control of the Senate, and you've got your industrial relations reform, which you think are essential, and I think are essential for productivity reform, but you still had a compromise. So that's in the back of the memory of the government. And the other view is, look, since 1996, by 2004, the economies don't stand still. There's still need for further changes and updating of industrial relations. So that's there as well. The government had a strong win, 2004, and I suspect also maybe at the back of the mind, maybe no one will admit this could be our last term in office. So maybe we should give it a go, right? That's what I would do, okay? Now, let's just talk about the Senate, this great body. Now, the Senate, we all know, historically became partisan very quickly. It never was a state's house, except occasionally. It became known as a chamber for old men, basically, where you sent political hacks and things like that. It was not taken seriously. I think the Senate was designed from the word go that the government would have control of it. And remember, and as I'm going to point out, governments mostly had control of it up to 1949, okay? So governments largely controlled except for a few brief periods. No one said the Australian democracy is going to come to an end when governments had control from the past, right? So why is it the world going to come to an end if the Howard government gets control of the Senate, okay? And I do find it really, really, really strange that the ALP, and I'm sorry to be partisan here, bangs on about the Senate. Are you kidding me? You're the mob who wants to abolish it. For 60 years, you wanted to abolish it. You didn't just want to abolish the Senate, you also had in your platform to abolish the governors, state governors, and to abolish state parliaments, the upper houses, right? So you're talking to me about the great thing about the Senate, but you want to abolish it for a long time. And the New South Wales Labor Party tried to abolish their upper house in 1961. And in Queensland, where I come from, unicameral legislation in 1922, done nefariously, done sneakily, despite a referendum to keep the upper house. So you don't talk to me about how great the Senate is from the other side. Let's get a little bit growing up here. It's all about power and politics and control, right? And then I think what's happened, who brought in the growth of the Senate and who brought in the change voting system? Labor Party. 1948 to sabotage Menzies, right? That's what happened. And the Senate's got bigger and bigger, and it's become harder and harder to get a majority. Let's get serious. So that's putting those things in things. Then about Westminster and what's been going on in Westminster. You seriously can't say we should adopt anything from Westminster, quite frankly. You must be joking. What a joke it is. Now when we talk Westminster, it is bicameral, but the upper house has largely not been voted. They don't have power to not voted, not elected in that sense. House of Lords, not elected. Canadian Senate, appointed. No Canadian province has had an upper house since 1968. New Zealand abolished their upper house in 1950. Where is this great bicameral Westminster system everyone's banging on about, that Harry Evans bangs on about? You're joking. One thing about the Australian Senate, it's been elected since the word go. The American Senate wasn't. Okay, so we were ahead of that game. So just putting that in a little bit of context when people go on about things. Okay, so here I am. Where am I sitting? What were the government's post-2004 motives? I've got legitimate arguments on one side, politics on the other. Won the election. Hey, we won the election. We did pretty well. House of Reps, okay? Majority, and we got a swing towards us. We won the Senate majority, first time in 20 years. That's legitimate. We've previously been talking about IR reform. We had to make lots of compromises. Why can't we revisit it? There's been ongoing economic change. The world does not stand still. Australia is in a big race, okay? We've got to keep the economy productive. And there's other reforms too, income tax reform and so on. On the political side, small window of opportunity, this could be it, boys and girls. We should go for it. It wasn't much mentioned in the election platform, but we do have a record of talking about this area. And sometimes there are some things you've got to do which aren't mentioned in election platforms. Might be thinking about our heritage. What are we going to leave posterity? Why not leave it with a decent, up-to-date industrial relations system that ditched all that stuff from the past? People talk about being progressive. Well, this could be progressive. And there are precedents for a government to have control of the Senate and to use their numbers to do what they want. What are we talking about? Is there some rules that governments that get a majority shouldn't use their numbers to do what they want to do? You're kidding me. That's what it's all about. And it's a way of embarrassing possibly the opposition. They're still wedded to a trade union movement. They're still run by the trade unions, are dying organisations, as we've heard today. I don't understand why they have so much power, but they seem to. Okay, so what did the government do? And remember, there was a lot of stuff in the media and by academics that the world was going to come to an end because the naughty Howard government had got control of the Senate. And my God, they'd won an election again, you know. Read the material at the time, read the context. This was not favourably reflected upon. John Howard made this promise. Okay, we're not going to be provocative, we're going to act wisely and so on. And that was repeated by members and so on. Now, whether that was the initial reaction. Maybe only Howard can tell us, but that's what he was trying to do. As time went on a bit, when work choices started to come to the fore, I think they said, well, now's our opportunity. We did have a little bit more upmarket approach to work choices. We are now in a position to drive industrial relations reform, which are consistent with liberal philosophy, okay? We need a single set of national laws on industrial relations. It's an idea whose time has come, all right? So time has come, we've got the numbers. We're going to use the numbers and our economy needs it. And if we have to use corporations' power, we'll use corporations' power. Now, Sean Carney's given a much more detailed discussion, but these are all the elements of work choices that were embodied in the legislation. Creation of national workplace relations system, increase employer capacity to make agreements, modernising awards, setting of minimum wages, establish Australian Fair Pay Commission, unfair dismissal removed for under 100 staff, Australian workplace agreements no longer subject to no disadvantage test, later changed, use of corporations' power. So a whole stack of things, and there'll be lots of arguments, but was this going too far? Was it too extreme? Since I'm in the sort of pro-economic productivity, I come from a small business background, unions weren't very big in our family, I'm probably say, wacko, let's go for it. But other people have different views. What were some of the assessments of it? One assessment by one academic said the reforms were not that radical, or a major departure of reform that really had begun with the Hawke-Keating government. Okay, if you actually look at it, they really were going the same direction that's been going for some time, driven by a deregulated economy, driven by an economy that's more globalised. The Howard government was quite right in trying to go down that direction. However, some problems. It wasn't in the election platform. So there's that sort of argument that because there wasn't the usual consultation and checking with the politics of it. And maybe had that been there, had it been more upfront, in a more modified form, it might have raised some alarms. It was rushed, despite the long time to get it there, I think it was rushed through the Senate very quickly. That's one thing. It was definitely overly complex. I think 600 pages, 800 pages. That's complex. Some of it had to be changed. There had to be further changes that we heard before. That made it confusing about it. And it was, I think someone asked a question, it was poorly marketed. And they didn't make the link to the economy. It became purely about people's conditions in the workplace, purely about people's wages, purely about people's rights. And when you hit on those notes, you're going to get an adverse reaction and so on. I also will question the choice of the minister concerned. I like Kevin Andrews quite a bit, but he didn't have a great background in this area, and he's not regarded as a great marketing person to sell it hard line, in a sense. Also, although many people don't belong to unions, I was an academic at the time and I'd just been elected to the NTEU and managed to stop a strike at the university. People still feel a bit uneasy if it's appearing to be union bashing and appearing to be holding unions in some sort of contempt, because they have a long history in Australia, rightly or wrongly. And because the government had control of the Senate, some of the other usual checks and balances that would operate when that didn't occur weren't in operation. So there was that going on, okay? I also have another argument, another view. The Howard government there were other issues burbling along in the background. Leadership, income tax, those sort of things too were distractions. So that's the argument about the industrial relations work choices. What about the other argument that the Howard government ran roughshod over the Senate, using its numbers, like the same way it would use its numbers in the House of Representatives to get things through? So here's the complaints. Question time was reduced, and there were less time for the ALP and minor parties to ask questions. There were fewer questions on notice answered, and so on. The gag and guillotine was used more often, used quite a bit in the House of Representatives. Legislative rush, especially WorkChoices, Australian Security Intelligence Agency, and so on. The committee system got restructured. There was a reduction in the number of committees. There were fewer references to committees. Why would a government do this? The response rate to committee reports fell. Okay, there were delays, and there were instructions for public servants not to answer questions, at estimates and so on, e.g. on the AWB Royal Commission sort of going on. This was seen as really the government being very roughshod and undemocratic over this great institution called the Senate. Estimate committees were altered and there was less scrutiny. So that sort of picture. Now, I'm not denying some of these things happened. I'm also saying, well, what government wouldn't? What government wants to have more scrutiny? Please, let's have more committees. We should not attack a government for doing what, logically, any government would do, any political party would do. There's no special rules about these things. But there's been a bit of a more positive said by Gwen Singleton. She said, yeah, okay, question time, there were less questions, but not as much as we made out. And I'll detail all this in my paper. And the ALP and the minor parties overcame this, because in the Senate, as you know, they have supplementary questions. So you can double barrel your questions a bit. But there was some reduction, but not as much as been made out. Senate committees, yeah, reduced numbers, but they were still fairly extensive and were used, and it did have impact and sometimes annoyed the government. Estimates committees still were probing. They're not like estimates committees like in my home state of Queensland, which are very, very short. The public service was generally cooperative, and we shouldn't forget that Mr Whitlam gave instructions to the public service not to answer questions. Okay? So what's the difference? And we forget another thing about a thing called non-Labor parties. People in non-Labor parties sometimes cross the floor, and they don't get expelled, mostly. Okay? Right? Now, this means you've got a different game going on. In the ALP, if you cross the floor, it's goodbye. Forever. In the coalition parties, they're generally more, more willing to accept that from time to time. And the National Party were causing a little bit of trouble at times. A new senator had arrived called Senator Joyce, the great retail politician of Australia. And there's been a lot of floor crossings of coalition members in the Senate. When I worked for a Minister for Education, we had to deal with almost as much with some of the Liberal senators as we did with the ALP and the Greens and the crossbench and so on a couple of aspects of things. So that's another bit of accountability. And there were some times during this period where the Howard government had to listen to their backbench and did have to change things, right? So that's another sort of role for accountability. And this coming on back to Harry Evans, in his later document, he pointed out that the Rudd government faced far less opposition, even though it didn't have control of the Senate, than what the Howard government had in its first 3 terms. That the opposition, the coalition opposition, was a little bit more cooperative in allowing things through than the Howard government experience. So I thought that was interesting. So the issue of the Senate, yes, the government did use its numbers. Which government wouldn't use its numbers in a so? So getting to my conclusions, on controlling the Senate, any government would have done the same. Okay, so any government would have used the Senate in this way. Opposition parties complain about threat to democratic process and accountability when a government has a majority in the Senate, but typically use power themselves when they have the opportunity. That's what I mean, politics for grown-ups, okay? Not politics for how things we think ought to be. Also, we come to, was the WorkChoices, was this the poison chalice? Had they not won control of the Senate, would John have gone on to be Prime Minister again and again? But we tend to think there are a whole stack of other factors that affected things. Latham in 2004 had really been the cause of why. One argument is how Latham, it was Latham people voted against, not for John Howard. But Judith Brett, in that document that she so condemns the Howard government, on page 1, she said, with the arrival of Kevin, it all changed. So just remember, within about 2 months of Kevin becoming leader, the opinion polls started to change, and they never altered. They never altered. So was it really the WorkChoices, or was it other factors? So I think Kevin's one thing. Howard's age. Sorry to raise this issue, but it was sort of, there was young baby-faced Kevin, there was Mr. Howard getting to my age, so that contrast was being made. Also, the Howard government was being portrayed as having no real agenda. They just had WorkChoices. They made changes to the Murray-Darling thing. They brought in an age thing. They did have quite a few things on the go and introduced in 2007. But the perceived agenda, this is an old government. It's got to go. Where I worked, the Rudd euphoria was quite extraordinary, and I couldn't understand it. There was the background of the AW Royal Commission, you know, that was in the background, something fishy, a bit tricky, that sort of thing was going things. There was the election turmoil with Costello. Now, Costello in his memoirs, unless I've misread it, doesn't mention WorkChoices anywhere, right? Doesn't mention it. He talks about income tax and his problems getting income tax through, and it's all John's fault about the election, and the 2004 election campaign wasn't any good anyway, and so on. So I thought he was deputy leader, but anyway. So same old, old government, old tricks. These are all these factors, and I myself think that WorkChoices did have a role, but if I'd been in John Howard's role, I would have gone for it too. And I would have think that, given the record of the Liberal Party, given what the context, we would have done the same. So, conclusions. The Howard government, as far as I'm concerned, and people might contest it, used its powers legitimately. They had a strong majority in the House of Representatives. They had a swing towards them. They got a majority in a democratically elected body, not an appointed body like Canada and England and other places. WorkChoices, not as extreme as portrayed, but I agree its perception was definitely portrayed as being extreme, okay? And its perceptions, and most people don't read 700 pages of legislation, they read headlines and so on, and the ALP and the unions did run, as Sean pointed out, a terrific campaign. There were historic precedents for governments to have control of the Senate. It didn't mean the end of democracy in Australia. Why did it suddenly mean something terribly going to happen now? And why are we shocked if politicians do things for politics? What's the shock? They do things to win. They do things to score. They do things to get their ideas through. They do things, they might call it for policy for the good of Australia or so on. Well, fine, that's fine. But why is exercising democratically elected power somehow tainted or wrong. I couldn't get it. And I think, as I've just outlined, there were other factors which I think were actually more important than just having control of the Senate. And maybe, as Sean has pointed out, maybe WorkChoices has had a longer lasting impact of a positive kind, which I didn't quite realise, that then has been accepted. And maybe that's been good for Australia. Things that deregulate largely tend to be effective as any economy going through that process. So my view, control of the Senate, was it quite the poison chalice? I don't think so. I think the Howard government decided to use its power legitimately to implement reforms, genuine reforms that had long talked about, which previous coalition governments hadn't had the guts to do, and they determined to get it through it. And I think underlying all this was the viewpoint this could be our last chance. So why not give it a go? So good on you, John Howard. Thank you.
So behind all this, do Australians in part know what they're doing when they cast their vote in the Senate? They're not saying nothing about its wisdom, but people vote differently in the Senate. Mm-hmm. And for the majority, as you've pointed out, since 1949, governments have not had control of the Senate. Is that because of the system or people's wishes?
Well, there's some evidence, and other political scientists can respond to this, that some people do vote for one party in the House of Reps to get the government, and they sometimes change their vote for the Senate. There's a fair amount of evidence for that. How many do it? We're not quite sure, but we'll want ex-government to be back in power, but I do like those independents running in the Senate, or the Greens running in the Senate, or whoever it may be. So I do think people exercise their vote far more flexibly than we sometimes give them credit for. They may not know what the outcome's going to be, but I used to see it quite a bit when I was doing election time and checking. Votes would often be quite variable about those things.
But governments, and the Howard government, didn't have a specific campaign to get itself the majority in the upper house. It just happened, as you say, even according to George Brandis, by surprise.
Yeah.
So is it a frailty or a failing of political parties, including the coalition in the Howard years, that it didn't have a strategy, a policy, an approach to achieve what it achieved despite itself?
I think they were always trying to get control of the Senate. I think the reason why we got control of the Senate this time was because of what happened in Queensland. The coalition got together on the Senate ticket, and it's been basically regarded for in more recent years, because of the growth of the size of the Senate, that it's impossible. It's certainly impossible for the ALP to get control of the Senate, and I think it was just such a surprise. So the governments always try to win maximum number of seats. I don't think governments go out and say, we're not going to give as much of a try. Every Senate campaign, every state, they do their very best. But this time, the numbers just happened, the swings just were on, and bang, there we have it.
Philip Ruddock.
I've been very hesitant about interrupting during the course of the day, but I thought I could add something useful on this occasion. Fraser had a particular view about where and when he should legislate, and it was very conditioned by the way in which we came to power in 1975. And he was very, very cautious about doing anything that he thought might bring about very significant civil disobedience because of the way in which he believed the government came to power and how it was seen. The second observation I would make was in relation to my Prime Minister, because you were right in observing that he was very cautious about interventions. He may remember that I wanted to legislate for defamation law reform using the corporation's power, and because he thought the states might be cautious about our intervention, he encouraged me to look for another course. involving cooperation, which I was able to achieve.
Can I just go back? Are you saying that Malcolm Fraser said, even after 1977, when he wins the record majority, that he's still thinking his government somehow lacks some legitimacy?
Well, I don't want to put it on a basis of years. I'm saying that's what he told me.
Okay.
Proportional representation, 1949. I suspect coalition members were equally glad sometimes that Labor did not have the numbers in the Senate. And it would be seen as a two-way street. I hope you'll forgive me for commenting on Nicola's piece, if I may.
Briefly.
Very briefly, but very pointedly, if I may. I passionately believe in human rights, and particularly the right to life. And I am very conscious in relation to human rights about the argument of proportionality. And at times you have to weigh up how you protect one human right that may impact upon others.
That's very helpful, thank you.
Okay.
Did you?
No comment.
All right. Other questions, perhaps? At the back.
Scott, the American Senate, of course, on which the Australian Senate is based, never has any problems with minor parties, or it does have problems with control, perhaps. It seems to me that the problem with the Australian Senate isn't so much. Well, there's two problems. One is the small number of states, and that's a mathematical thing, and the other is the idiocy of the nexus, which means the Senate has constantly increased in size. So it's actually a thing that we've caused for ourselves. I did the mathematics on this. If we had 12 states rather than 6, there'd probably be no minor parties and a major party. So if it's an accident that they were elected a majority in 2004, it's also an accident of our institutional design that our Senate is the way that it is. And I should add that the constitutional fathers actually envisaged that there would be many more states. So I wonder if they would have gone to the way that the Senate is worked if they had known that they would be stuck with 6 states forever.
Well, that's a hypothetical question, and a long way from where we are in 2004. Yes, I know we modelled ourselves on the American Senate, except our Senate was elected from the word go. American Senate didn't really become elected to about, 1913, is that right? It used to be nominated by the states. Well, I wish you the best of luck when you have more states. That's I don't think ever going to happen. Maybe North Queensland should be a state, Northern New South Wales and so on. I do think it's rather problematical. We've got 76 senators for 25 million people, and America has 100 senators for 350 million people. I've got a problem with that. And I do have a problem with 12 senators from Tasmania as a Queenslander, since we're propping up Tasmania all the time, as you know. So that doesn't really solve our problems. I think the issue is the Senate, in a way, where the government doesn't have control, doesn't sit well with the idea of the executive government that we have used to in Australia, very much so. And there's been reforms of the upper houses around Australia. I don't recommend the Queensland model of having no upper house. Perhaps if we had an upper house in Queensland, Campbell Newman might still be Premier. He might have been restrained from some of the things that we did. It was the LNP policy, following an excellent book that came out in 2008, for a time in Queensland to have an upper house, but they've now dropped that solution.
Who edited the book, Scott?
Yes, Scott Prasser.
But the issue is that Greg's raising is, have we got something that we've either lost control of that's evolving in ways that are unhelpful for our governance, given that I presume we're saying that the appetite for constitutional reform is minimal. So is there something that we can do?
Yeah. Well, look, I don't think we should underestimate the ability to get things through the Senate, right? So 5 years of my life have been working for Senator Birmingham. Okay, well, I think an excellent education minister. What did we get through the Senate in June 2017 was amendments to the Education Act and a better, fairer funding model. Okay, so we did it. We got it through, and thanks to Senator Birmingham's efforts and negotiation. It cost the taxpayer more money, by the way, to get it through. Let me tell you, lots of money. And the second senator I worked for was Senator Mackenzie, who got through the industrial chemicals bills, which no one here knows anything about, which just about killed us. But it was a reformist legislation. It had been sitting in the Senate for 15 months. The previous minister had not been able to get it through, and we got it through with the support of the ALP, the Greens and the crossbench completely, without giving up very much. So it can be done, and Senator Cormann's office was superb in managing those things. So you can do it. It just does make things a lot harder to do it. But if you've got a determined and capable minister and an effort to get it through, you can get things done. So it's not impossible. It just makes life more difficult. And it would have been really great, and my life would have been a lot easier had we had control of the Senate in 2017, 18 and 19.
And more expensive as well.
It just cost more money.
A final question from Dr. Nicola McGarry.
Thanks very much. I think a lot of my colleagues at the University of New South Wales would have actually been amongst those saying that the coalition winning control of the Senate was the death of responsible government. So if I hadn't been sold previously on your argument, I would have been after what you've just said. But I do want to raise a question about whether there's a distinction to be drawn between the use of the Senate in that period in relation to issues that were partisan issues like WorkChoices, as opposed to issues that were not partisan issues like national security and the way in which they were approached in the Senate. I mean, the sort of trends that I've tried to draw out in relation to national security policy are things like sort of a refusal to clearly explain the reasons for particular national security reforms, sort of quite a defensive approach in terms of stymieing the level of debate that occurred. And those things I find particularly problematic, I guess, because there was a very clear indication from the opposition that they weren't in principally opposed to these provisions, unlike something like WorkChoices, but rather was in principle in favour of the substance of the reforms, but wanted time to consider them and wanted time to think through the implications and possible amendments. So I wonder whether there's a distinction to be drawn between sort of positive and understandable and appropriate uses of the Senate, the grown-up politics, and where improvements might be made in the future if we end up in that situation
I partly agree with you, but firstly, everything is partisan. Everything is political. There's no such thing as non-partisan. Okay? I know it sounds pretty cruel. I do agree that some things could have probably been, especially on national security issues that I looked at, could have been done with a bit more calm and less force. But once governments are on the roll, then governments want to get things done. And once you've got this opportunity, the pressure cooker starts. And it takes, back when Fraser had control of the House of Representatives and the Senate, and after the 77 election, I remember quite distinctly that the opposition was causing a lot of problems in delaying debate and discussions and so on. And the reason why I know this is because I was sitting in the Whip's office when all this stuff was going on at the time. And there was a move within the Fraser government saying, oh look, let's just push this through. Let's guillotine this legislation. It wasn't major legislation, but there were some wiser heads in the government said, let's allow the opposition. After all, they do represent Her Majesty's opposition. Governments, it's all about context in a sense. Governments will tend to want to use their power once they've got it. And sometimes a bit of calm is good. Sometimes those discussions were good. The reason we got the industrial bills through was actually sitting down and talking to the environment groups and talking to the ALP and being very firm about what we were going to do and not do. And we got it through without much change. But the trying to railroad it through would not have worked, and you're quite correct. And that's where political acumen in school is needed by the elected official as well as the ministerial office.
Sometimes it happens to us at conferences as the day goes on, we sort of fade, but not today. And for stirring us up, for making us think, and for turning a few sacred cows into hamburgers, would you please join with me in thanking Scott Prasser.